Okay, so today's story gets into another situation of the fact that our current president likes to act like he's a king, okay, which is obviously not how our country is supposed to work. So there are some cases working their way up through the Supreme Court, 3 of which will be heard next week, and they're all about presidential power. Is the president overusing his power, right? We saw this back during the impeachment hearings where President Trump would just or the White House, which is really coming from President Trump, would just tell people they're not allowed to testify. And then, of course, at the end of the impeachment, everyone turned around and, the big phrase, there's no there. There's no evidence. There's no, hey, this didn't turn out to really look that bad for the president, when they weren't letting anyone testify. The very people who had the information weren't allowed to testify. Well, we're seeing other situations of that where Congress is trying to get their hands on information and the president is stopping them. So there's 3 cases coming up next week, all of which do this. So we've got 3 cases coming up next week, all of which are pretty close to affecting Trump, and he has basically told these companies that they're not allowed to turn over the papers that Congress wants. So one is a company called Mazars, is basically who does Trump's accounting, right? They're like his accounting firm. And then there's Deutsche Bank, which most people have heard of because he has had some dealings with Deutsche Bank, which at least on the outside look a little bit shady, and you kind of have to question what's really going on. So Congress is trying to get documents from Mazars and from Deutsche Bank so that they can investigate and find out, even before Trump took office, was there sketchy stuff going on? Now that he's in office, is there sketchy stuff going on? These are really important that we need to know because let's keep this in mind, and we'll use a good quote from the article as I wrap things up, but let's keep this in mind while we're listening to this, that investigating Trump is not really about a witch hunt. It's not really about trying to find him guilty of something. It's about rule of law. It's about the fact that we as a country need to have people in charge who respect rule of law, who follow rules, and don't expect to be able to be treated differently, like there's some kind of a king who can just make decrees. The people in our government who are most powerful are the very ones we need to be watching the closest. And if there are people who are getting out of line, then we need to be able to handle that, and we need to make sure that our checks and balances are in place to make sure that that doesn't go unchecked, right? So for the 3 cases, we've got this. They are maddening because in all 3 cases, especially in the first 2, existing law is clear that President Trump should lose. Mazars and Deutsche Bank concern Trump's attempts to immunize himself from congressional oversight, seeking access to many of his financial records. Meanwhile, Vance involves a New York prosecutor's investigation into alleged criminal activity by the Trump Organization, which also seeks some of Trump's financial records. So these are 3 totally different situations, right, in cases going on where people are trying to get a hold of paperwork, but Trump is saying, nope, I'm the president. You can't look into anything related to me at all. No one can testify against me. Anyone that I've ever met is not allowed to testify in front of Congress. Nothing that makes me look bad. And there are cases going through the Supreme Court which will decide that. Now, this is worrisome because as we talk about frequently on this channel, the Supreme Court is basically being taken over, as is the whole federal court system, right? This is going to be the thing that puts Mitch McConnell in the history books, because we're going to be dealing with it for decades after Mitch McConnell has left this world, that there are young judges that they are trying to appoint, which, it's a lifetime appointment. They'll be around forever. Some of which, right, many of which are actually rated unqualified by the Bar Association. So they're not even qualified. McConnell is putting them in place because then they know these people are basically going to owe them. Oh, we put these hardcore Republican judges in place. Now they're going to have to find in our favor. And this is basically what happened under Obama. So Obama didn't get his pick, right? McConnell held out for over a year, totally unconstitutional to do that, but it worked for him, right? The Republicans pull this stuff and it works. So they got an extra conservative judge put on the court. And so people are wondering what's really going to happen when the Supreme Court decides these cases. Now, from a legal standpoint, it's pretty clear Trump's on the losing end of these things. But with the way the Supreme Court has been slanted, we don't really know how it's going to turn out. Are these judges going to stand by rule of law, or are these judges going to stand by this conservative idea that they think needs to be put above that? That's really what we're wondering about and where things are going here. So if that sounds like I'm being a little bit dramatic, let's listen to a situation and we'll hear what Trump's lawyers, while arguing these cases, are saying. So let's take a look here. This is Trump's lawyers. Remember, this is Trump's lawyers that we're listening to.
It has to.
And what's your view on the Fifth Avenue example? Local authorities couldn't investigate. They couldn't do anything about it.
I think once a president is removed from office, any local authority. This is not a permanent immunity.
Well, I'm talking about while in office.
No.
That's the hypo. Nothing could be done. That's your position.
That is correct. That is correct.
So in other words, Trump's lawyers are taking the position that as long as Trump is in office, he's untouchable. Nothing can be done to him. Nothing can happen. He is allowed to do whatever he wants. He is untouchable. This is the same as saying he is above the law. They even asked about Trump's famous quote about shooting someone on the middle of Fifth Avenue, and you heard what his lawyer had to say about it. This is exactly what we don't need in this country. We don't need it for Trump and the Republicans, and you know what? When a Democrat is in office, we don't need it for a Democrat president either. No president that we elect should be having this kind of power. And we can't have this, because the problem is once you introduce these things, it erodes our democracy permanently. It's really, really difficult to get it back. So these are the kind of sick ideas we cannot be allowing to progress. We need to get our democracy in order. We need to get this taken care of. All right, then we have, but the broader investigation into foreign money laundering and similar crimes touches on Trump and his businesses. According to a 2017 article in USA Today, Trump and his companies have been linked to at least 10 wealthy former Soviet businessmen with alleged ties to criminal organizations or money laundering. Okay, so, I mean, does that sound like someone who's just totally innocent and it's a witch hunt? I mean, there's serious evidence here that there is sketchy stuff going on with the companies that Trump was involved in before he came into office. And if you're paying attention, there's an awful lot of sketchy stuff happening while he's in office. Okay, so this is exactly not what we need happening right now. Okay, so before we get into the next quote that I'd like to read, we need to understand why congressional subpoenas are so important. And it's because our country, with its 3 branches of government, needs to have those 3 branches not being bullied by the other 2 or even by another one. So Congress really has to have the power to subpoena, because, as has been pointed out by the administration, Congress is really the only outlet for keeping the president in check. So they have these subpoenas. They can subpoena people that they need to come testify before Congress so they can have appropriate investigations. And then also we need these other investigations going on so that we can see if there's other sketchy stuff going on with Trump and his businesses. Okay, but one of the things that came up during the Mueller report was they essentially were just ignoring the subpoenas, right? Congress would subpoena witnesses, and then Trump would say, don't show up. You're not allowed to show up. You can't go talk about me. We're not going to do that. And Bill Barr would stand by that. You know, when you own the DOJ, you can decide what's going to be enforced and what isn't. So it's, you know, it's like it was kind of a movie trope back in the 80s and 90s. You go to some small town, there's some sheriff there, and things just go according to what he says. Well, that sheriff knows what the law is, but if you're the only person around that's in charge of enforcing it, or you're the person at the top in charge of enforcing it, then you can say, oh, you know what, that crime over there, we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to deal with that situation. And that's essentially what's going on here. Congress puts out subpoenas, and then they're just ignored, and there's no bite to it. Well, clearly that's not what was intended by our government. The founding fathers weren't sitting around saying, let's give Congress subpoena power, but then let's make sure there's no teeth to that. Let's make sure they can't do anything when people don't show up for the subpoena. So the law itself is fairly clear. Congress gets to subpoena people, and you're supposed to show up and abide by that subpoena. So this is the law is clear what should be happening next week when these three cases come up. Basically, Trump should be on the losing end of them. But we'll see how that goes. We'll see if that's actually how it turns out. This is going to be a big test for the Supreme Court to see if the Supreme Court is anything resembling an actual court of judges who care anything about rule of law. And then we'll also see, okay, once that's done, does the Department of Justice actually follow through with what it's supposed to do? It remains to be seen how this is going to all turn out. Right. So, the subpoena itself is a piece of paper. It's not like that piece of paper is powerful. That subpoena is powerful because of the power that we put into it. It's like paper money, right? That paper itself doesn't have a whole lot of value. It's the value that we as a country recognize in the American dollar, that fiat currency. We give it meaning. It's the same thing with the subpoena. You can write up a subpoena, but if there's no teeth behind it, there's no point to it. That's clearly not what the founding fathers had intended, was that Congress would subpoena people and then those people would just ignore it. Well, what is the point? How is Congress supposed to be able to govern at all? Now, in the past, the Supreme Court has kind of tried to sidestep this by saying, well, we don't want to get involved between the president and Congress having their dispute, because that would be one side taking action over the other. No, that's exactly what the Supreme Court is there for, right? Other reasons as well, but that's one of the things they're there for. When the president and Congress are butting heads and can't decide how things are supposed to move forward, the judges are supposed to step in and go, yeah, we know the law. We got this figured out. Here's what's supposed to happen. Trump, you're going to let people testify, right? So this is pretty important. A lot of times the stuff going on in the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary doesn't get as much press as it should, but a lot of these cases are far-reaching. They have lots of effect on things, just like this. I mean, if these cases don't go well, then Congress is going to lose a huge amount of its power. We'll be moving away from having three checks and balances to just, essentially a king who gets to do whatever he wants. That's not really what most of us want. Okay, so back to the article. Under this view, the president should be a subject of investigation because he is powerful and because that power gives an unchecked president tremendous ability to behave in an abusive and corrupt manner. So it's not that we're investigating the president because we're looking for things that he's done wrong. It's because he is the most powerful person. We need to know if he's doing things wrong. And that knowingness that you will be investigated in most cases is also going to tone people back, right? You've got this idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that's why we need to not have absolute power. We need checks and balances in place. So it's not that there's a witch hunt where we're just going to find anything we can wrong with what Trump has done. It's because, at least in the situations we're talking about today, this is an actual erosion of American democracy. All right, and our closing quote from the article: especially in the congressional subpoena cases, existing law clearly indicates that Trump should lose before the Supreme Court. The question for the justices is whether they believe that protecting the most powerful man in the nation is so important that it is worth scrapping much of that existing law. So this isn't just hyperbole. This is what it's coming down to. We are literally looking at the ability of government to check and balance the president while he is in office, which he needs to be checked and balanced. Keep your eyes out. We'll see how things go next week with the Supreme Court. Hopefully, we'll still have checks and balances after the Supreme Court comes out. Otherwise, they will have proven that this gambit that Mitch McConnell pulled was, basically overthrowing our democracy, and that it worked very successfully. We'll see. So keep an eye on how these things turn out. We'll update on it later. Okay, so thanks for checking out the video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can catch all the new material as it becomes available, and we'll see you in the future.